Whitney Houston was about to deliver what would become the most iconic national anthem performance in Super Bowl history. Desert Storm had just begun, and America needed hope. 50,000 seats waited to be filled. Millions of television viewers prepared to watch, and the NFL had orchestrated every second of the spectacle with military precision. But then, during the final rehearsal, something happened that no one saw coming. A voice from outside the stadium, broken and weathered, sang along to Whitney's practice run of the Star-Spangled Banner. Security moved to silence the disturbance, but Whitney did something that stopped the entire production. She walked off the stage, out of the stadium, and toward a homeless Vietnam veteran who was crying on the sidewalk. What she did next would delay a billion-dollar broadcast, bring 73,000 people to tears, and prove that sometimes the most important performance happens when nobody is watching. To understand that January afternoon, you need to understand the immense pressure Whitney was under. This was not just another performance. It was the Super Bowl during wartime. America was 7 days into Operation Desert Storm. Families across the country were terrified for their children overseas. The NFL had asked Whitney to deliver a performance that could somehow unite and heal a divided, frightened nation. Whitney arrived in Tampa 3 days before the game. The musical arrangement had been rewritten 5 times. Backup recordings were prepared. Security was heightened. Every note, gesture, and breath was being scrutinized. Her longtime musical director, Ricky Minor, later revealed she was battling severe anxiety. She wasn't sleeping or eating, and she rehearsed the anthem for hours alone. But she also carried a private burden. Her cousin, Marcus Houston, a Marine, had been deployed to Kuwait just weeks earlier. Every time she sang Rocket's Red Glare, she pictured him dodging real ones. For Whitney, this song wasn't just an anthem. It was a prayer for her family. His name was Robert James Mitchell, though most people who passed him called him nothing at all. To the world, he was just another forgotten face among the thousands who drifted through the streets of Tampa, invisible, silent, and seemingly beyond saving. But once, long ago, Robert had worn a uniform that commanded respect. Once, his name had been spoken with pride. At 52, Robert had been homeless for nearly 14 years. His skin was weathered by the Florida sun, his hair streaked with gray, his clothes a mismatched armor against the indifference of the world. Yet beneath the layers of dirt and years of neglect still lived the shadow of a soldier, a man who had once believed in courage, loyalty, and honor. 23 years earlier, he had been Sergeant Robert J. Mitchell, United States Army, serving in the jungles of Vietnam. Back then, he was 19 and certain of his purpose. Like so many young men of his generation, he had enlisted out of a fierce belief that his country needed him, that he could make a difference. Robert had grown up in a small Ohio town, the son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher. His father, a World War II veteran, had taught him that serving one's country was the highest form of duty. So when the draft notice arrived, Robert didn't run to Canada or protest in the streets. He went willingly. His mother cried at the bus station, clutching his hand until the final boarding call. He promised he'd be home before Christmas. It would be another 4 years before he set foot on American soil again. Vietnam changed him, as it changed everyone who went there. He served 2 tours, Khe Sanh, Hue, the Mekong Delta, names that would echo in his nightmares for decades. He watched friends die inches from him. He learned to sleep in the rain, to eat when he could, to keep moving no matter how heavy his pack or how loud the artillery. He earned a Purple Heart after taking shrapnel in his left leg during the Tet Offensive. The wound never fully healed. Some of the metal fragments were too deep to remove. Even years later, the leg would ache every time the weather changed, a physical reminder of a war most Americans wanted to forget. Robert had believed that when he returned home, things would be different. He imagined stepping off the plane to cheers, flags, maybe even a brass band like his father had after the Second World War. Instead, when he arrived at the San Francisco airport in 1971, there were no parades, no welcome, only protest signs and angry faces. He never forgot the first words someone shouted at him. "Baby killer." The spit hit his cheek before he could even set down his duffel bag. He stood frozen, the metal on his chest suddenly feeling like a weight of shame. That moment broke something inside him, not all at once, but like a crack that spreads slowly until it consumes everything. The years that followed blurred together. Job interviews ended quickly when they saw Vietnam on his resume. The nightmares never stopped. Loud noises made him flinch. Fireworks sent him to the floor. There was no name for what he was feeling back then. No diagnosis. No help. Just booze and silence. Alcohol dulled the edges of memory until it became the only thing he could rely on. It cost him his marriage within 2 years. His wife, Sarah, took their 3-year-old daughter, Jennifer, and left for Oregon. He promised he'd call, that he'd get better. But the bottles always won. Calls went unanswered. Letters were never sent. By 1977, Robert had drifted out of the system completely. Shelters, park benches, overpasses. He learned how to survive on almost nothing. He stopped expecting people to see him. He stopped using his full name. To most, he was just the vet. And in his darkest moments, he believed maybe that was all he deserved to be. But through all the years of loss and silence, one thing tethered him to humanity: music. It was the one thing that could cut through the fog, that could momentarily remind him of who he had been before the war. Sometimes he would hum old Motown songs from his youth. Other times, he'd find himself quietly singing hymns he'd learned in church as a boy. But nothing stirred him quite like the Star-Spangled Banner. Whenever he heard those opening notes, "Oh, say can you see," something inside him would stand a little taller. The song brought back the memory of standing in formation, the flag rippling against a Southeast Asian sky, believing that what he was doing mattered. The anthem reminded him of home, of pride, of the promise that his service had once meant something. It was the last piece of faith he had left. So when, in January 1991, he heard through the crackling speaker of his transistor radio that Whitney Houston, the voice of America itself, would be singing the national anthem at the Super Bowl, something long dormant inside him flickered to life. He didn't know much about her beyond that voice, that soaring, angelic sound that sometimes played from the diner windows downtown. But when he heard her name, something stirred. Maybe it was the timing. America was once again at war, this time in the Persian Gulf. Maybe it was the thought of hearing that song live, the song that had kept him alive when nothing else could. He made a decision. He would find a way to hear Whitney Houston sing the anthem, even if it meant standing outside the stadium gates, surrounded by noise and strangers, just to feel close to that sound. He would walk the 2 miles to Tampa Stadium on the day of rehearsal. His left leg, still aching from the shrapnel he'd carried since Vietnam, would protest every step. But he didn't care. He wasn't trying to get inside. He knew that was impossible. He just wanted to be near the music, to feel, if only for a few minutes, like he was part of something larger than his own sorrow. And when he finally reached the stadium, the air heavy with the hum of generators and the echo of distant instruments, he would hear that voice rise, clear and impossibly pure, across the Florida afternoon. Whitney Houston's voice. And without realizing it, Robert James Mitchell, the forgotten soldier, would find himself singing along. On January 22nd, Robert rose before dawn. The air was cool, heavy with the salty breath of Tampa Bay, and his old army jacket did little to keep him warm. He could barely bend his left leg anymore. The shrapnel from Vietnam still lodged deep inside. Each step sent a dull ache through his hip, but he ignored it. He had learned long ago that pain was just another kind of companion. He walked the 2 miles to Tampa Stadium, limping along the cracked sidewalks, passing rows of parked cars and vendors setting up their carts. Every few blocks, the wind carried faint echoes of music, brass instruments warming up, a drumline finding its rhythm, the hum of a crowd gathering for something far bigger than him. By the time he reached the chain-link fence outside the stadium, his breath came shallow and ragged. He leaned against a lamppost, the Florida sun now climbing higher, and listened. For a few minutes, there was only the low thrum of distant voices. Then, somewhere beyond the concrete walls, he heard it, a single, clear note cutting through the noise. Whitney had begun rehearsing. The moment the words reached him, Robert froze. The sound hit him like a wave, pure, effortless, soaring above the stadium and into the sky. He had heard the national anthem 1,000 times before, but never like this. It wasn't just singing, it was a prayer, a cry of promise. He sank slowly onto the sidewalk, the asphalt still cool beneath him. His hands trembled as he pressed them to his knees. Tears, sudden and uninvited, welled in his eyes. He hadn't cried in years. Not when he'd lost his home, not when he'd watched his daughter's last letter disintegrate in the rain. But now he couldn't stop. His voice, cracked, weary, trembling, joined hers. Barely more than a whisper, yet somehow strong enough to carry through the wind. Inside the stadium, Whitney paused mid-phrase. She frowned slightly, pulling out one of her earpieces. Something had caught her attention. A faint echo, off rhythm but unmistakably human, threading its way through the concrete and steel. She turned toward her band, gesturing for them to stop. "Hold on," she said softly. Her sound engineer looked puzzled. "Everything all right, Miss Houston?" Whitney tilted her head, listening again. The faint voice, rough, broken, was still singing somewhere outside the east gate. The way he sang wasn't pretty, but it was honest, raw in a way that made her chest tighten. She handed her microphone to one of her backup singers. "Someone out there needs to be heard," she said, already walking toward the exit. Her bodyguard, a tall man in sunglasses, stepped forward. "Whitney, you can't just—" She looked at him firmly but gently. "It's fine. Please, just a minute." Outside, the noise of the crowd faded to a low hum as she approached the eastern entrance. The January sunlight caught the edge of her white rehearsal jacket as she rounded the corner, and there he was. A man sitting cross-legged on the pavement, his clothes frayed, his face streaked with tears and dirt. But his voice, that fragile, quivering voice, was still rising to meet hers. Whitney stopped a few feet away, listening. For a moment, the entire world seemed to narrow to just two voices, one powerful and clear, the other trembling but steadfast. The distance between them collapsed with the final line. When the echo faded, Whitney took a step forward and knelt beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who had carried the weight of something unbearable for far too long. Finally, she whispered, "That was beautiful." Robert blinked, disbelieving. No one had spoken to him like that in years. He lifted his head, and for the first time in what felt like forever, looked directly into another person's eyes. There was no pity in hers, only recognition. She asked softly, "Did you serve?" He hesitated, as if the answer belonged to another lifetime. "Vietnam," he said at last. 67 to 71. Whitney's expression changed, gentler, sadder. "My father served there too," she said quietly. "And my cousin's in Kuwait right now. When I sing this song," she placed a hand over her heart, "I sing it for you." Robert's throat tightened. The tears came again, and he didn't bother to hide them. "I gave everything," he managed to say, his voice shaking. "And they forgot about me." Whitney reached out, her hand steady and warm against his. "They might have forgotten," she said softly, "but I haven't, and I won't." Then she smiled, that unmistakable radiant smile the whole world would soon know. "It's an honor to meet you, Sergeant Robert Mitchell." For the first time in years, Robert felt seen, not as a vagrant, not as a casualty of history, but as a man who had once stood for something. And for the first time in even longer, he believed that maybe, just maybe, his song wasn't over yet. Whitney turned to security and said, "He's coming inside." Robert protested. His clothes were torn, his body worn. "I can't go in there." Whitney's response was fierce. "You belong there more than anyone. You fought for this country. You're coming in with me." And she meant it. She walked him into Tampa Stadium, past staff, cameras, and NFL executives who didn't dare say no. Whitney seated Robert in the front row, gave him food and water, introduced him to the band, and told her musicians, "This is who we're singing for." Then, she returned to the stage and sang the Star-Spangled Banner directly to him. Every note, every breath was filled with gratitude. Robert stood at attention, saluting, tears running down his face. When the final note rang out, The entire stadium erupted in applause, not for a pop star, but for a moment of humanity. That night, long after the stadium lights had dimmed and the last echo of music had faded into the Florida air, Whitney Houston sat alone in her hotel suite overlooking the bay. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. She couldn't stop thinking about him. The man outside the stadium, the soldier with the trembling voice and haunted eyes. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him sitting there on the pavement, singing through his tears. His voice had cracked, but had been true. Whitney had sung to presidents and kings, to millions of people across the world. But that afternoon, when she'd sung to Robert Mitchell, she had felt something different, something sacred. For the first time in a long while, the anthem hadn't been a performance. It had been a promise. She set her tea aside and picked up the phone. There were things to be done, and she was not a woman who left things unfinished. The first call was to a rehabilitation center for veterans in Jacksonville, one her father had once donated to. She explained what she wanted: a full treatment plan, medical and psychological, for a veteran named Sergeant Robert J. Mitchell. When the administrator asked how long she intended to sponsor his stay, Whitney didn't hesitate. As long as it takes, she said simply. He's already paid more than enough. Her next call was quieter, more personal. She reached out to a private investigator she'd worked with before, a discreet man who could find anyone, anywhere. She gave him all the details she had. The daughter's name, Jennifer, last known to be somewhere in Oregon. Find her, Whitney said. Tell her father's alive, and that someone still believes in him. When she hung up, she sat in silence for a long time, looking out over the dark water. The war had never touched her directly, but she had grown up with it in the background. The news, the funerals, the men who came home and never truly came home. Her own father had carried invisible wounds from his service. She knew what it meant to lose yourself in the aftermath. She wasn't about to let that happen to Robert again. Her final call was the most difficult, to the NFL. The league's media director picked up, formal and wary, thanking her again for agreeing to perform at the Super Bowl. Whitney's tone was calm, but unwavering. "There's one more thing," she said. She told them about Robert, who he was, what he had given, and what he had become. She wanted him shown during the broadcast, even just for a moment. Not as a spectacle, but as a symbol for every forgotten veteran who had given everything and been left behind. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then came the hesitation she'd expected. "We're not sure that fits the tone of the event, Miss Houston." Whitney's voice cooled, steady and firm. "Then find someone else to sing your anthem." The silence that followed was long. She could hear papers shuffling, hushed voices conferring in the background. Finally, the official came back on the line. His tone had changed. "We'll make it happen." Whitney thanked him softly, hung up the phone, and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the first light of morning began to creep across the horizon. She exhaled slowly, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion. For the first time in years, she felt that her voice, her fame, her reach had been used for something that truly mattered. Somewhere out there, a broken soldier might have a second chance. And in less than 2 weeks, when she stepped onto that field to sing before the entire world, she would be singing for him. The world watched as Whitney Houston stepped onto the field in a white tracksuit, the American flag patch gleaming on her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, a nation at war again, uncertain and divided, waiting for a moment of unity. When the first notes of the Star-Spangled Banner rang out, silence fell. Whitney's voice rose pure and effortless, filling the Tampa night. And then, as the orchestra swelled, the cameras cut to a man in the stands. Robert James Mitchell, clean-shaven, wearing a new suit and tie, clothes Whitney had quietly sent him. Tears streamed down his face as he stood, hand over heart, mouthing every word. Viewers across America didn't know his name, but they felt his story. In that instant, he wasn't a stranger or a statistic. He was America itself, wounded, resilient, unforgotten. Whitney's voice trembled slightly as she reached the final line. This time, she wasn't performing. She was praying. "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." When the last note faded, The crowd erupted. That performance became legend, not just for Whitney's flawless voice, but for the truth that Robert had brought to it. 2 days later, Robert checked into the rehabilitation center Whitney had arranged. For the first time in decades, he slept in a clean bed, under a roof that wasn't borrowed from the streets. Whitney visited him 3 times during his treatment. No cameras, no reporters, just quiet conversation and shared strength. Meanwhile, the investigator she'd hired found Jennifer, his daughter, 25 now, with 2 children of her own. Whitney made the arrangements herself. When Robert met Jennifer and his grandchildren for the first time in 19 years, he could barely speak. They simply held each other for a long time, the years between them dissolving into tears and forgiveness. By July 1991, Robert was sober, employed, and rebuilding his life. Whitney helped him find housing, steady work, and therapy. He began speaking at VA hospitals and veteran events, telling his story, not as a tragedy, but as proof that no one is ever too far gone to be found. He always carried a single photograph in his wallet. Whitney smiling beside him, a handwritten message across the bottom. For Sergeant Robert Mitchell, who reminded me what the anthem really means. With respect and love. Whitney. And for the rest of his life, whenever he heard that song again, Robert stood a little taller, knowing he had finally come home. In the years that followed, Whitney and Robert stayed in touch, an unlikely friendship born from a single song and a shared moment of grace. She never forgot him. Whenever her tours brought her to Florida, she made sure his name was on the guest list, front row seats, always. After the shows, she'd find him backstage, hug him, and ask about his daughter, his job, his grandkids. Robert, for his part, never stopped being amazed that someone like Whitney Houston considered him a friend. Yet she did, without pretense, without pity. Just kindness. He attended her wedding in 1992, sitting quietly among stars and dignitaries, his eyes bright with pride. A few months later, when Jennifer's second child was born, a package arrived from New Jersey. Baby clothes, a silver rattle, and a handwritten card that read, "Love, Aunt Whitney." Their story spread, quietly at first, then grew. Reporters heard about it, veterans groups took notice, and soon, real change began to ripple outward. The city of Tampa launched a new program, the Tampa Bay Stand Down, providing shelter, health care, and job support for homeless veterans. Even the NFL, moved by what had happened, began forming partnerships with veterans organizations, funding outreach programs across the country. Neither Whitney nor Robert had ever sought recognition, but their moment outside that stadium had become something larger, a reminder of the compassion still possible in a world so quick to forget. When Whitney Houston passed away in 2012, the world mourned a voice that had defined a generation. For Robert, then 73 and still sober, her death was deeply personal. He stood at a memorial service in Tampa, speaking to a small crowd of friends, family, and veterans. His voice was calm, steady, but heavy with emotion as he recalled that fateful January afternoon in 1991. The greatest singer in the world stopped a rehearsal because she heard a broken soldier singing outside. He said, pausing as tears welled in his eyes. "She gave me back my life." The room was silent, hanging on his words. Robert's story had become a symbol, proof of the power of human compassion, of seeing someone when the world looked away. Robert lived for 7 more years, surrounded by his daughter, grandchildren, and the community he had helped rebuild. He became an advocate for homeless veterans, sharing his journey at VA hospitals and rehabilitation centers, always emphasizing that second chances are possible and that dignity and recognition can save lives. When he passed away in 2019, at the age of 80, those who loved him celebrated a life transformed. The service was quiet, intimate, a reflection of the way he had lived his later years, sober, purposeful, and connected. Though Whitney had been gone for 7 years, her influence remained. The life she had helped restore, the hope she had inspired, and the enduring reminder that sometimes one act of attention and care can change everything. Whitney Houston's Super Bowl performance remains the greatest rendition of the national anthem in history. Flawless, powerful, and unforgettable. Yet the true performance, the one that carried the most meaning, didn't happen under the stadium lights. It happened outside on a cold sidewalk, where she paused her rehearsal to listen, really listen, to a broken soldier whose life had been all but forgotten. In that moment, Whitney chose compassion over perfection, humanity over spectacle. She didn't just sing for America that day. She sang to it, reminding every viewer, every citizen, that behind every statistic about homelessness or war lies a human being with a story, a name, and a life that matters. And in doing so, she showed the world that sometimes the most important performance is the one that happens when no one is watching.